Good afternoon. Welcome to the Virginia Festival of the Books, sponsored by the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities. This panel is called Fighting for Civil Rights Through Education and War. My name is Kara Dixon Buick, and I'm a fellow at the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here this afternoon. I'll be moderating the panel today, which features two authors, Stephanie Deutsch and Daniel L Haulman, who are here to talk to us about their books on the Rosenwald Schools and the Tuskegee Airmen. A few program notes to begin. First, I'd like to point out that C-SPAN is filming this production for BookTV, so please be sure your cell phones are off. I like to remind my students of that sometimes. Please be sure your cell phones are off. Also, remember that the Festival of the Book is free of charge, not free of cost. If you would like to support the festival, you can go online or pick up a giving packet at any of the information booths. We'd also appreciate it if after today's panel you would complete your program evaluation, which is the yellow sheet that you've been handed, which helps us to develop the program in future years. So for the format for today's panel, I will introduce the authors. They will each have a few minutes to introduce their books, to talk briefly about them, and then we will have what I envision will be a very lively discussion between yourselves and the authors, after which you will, of course, have the opportunity to purchase the books that you see in front of you and have them signed by the authors. So to begin, Stephanie Deutsch is the author of You Need a Schoolhouse, Booker T. Washington, Julius Rosenwald, and the Building of Schools for the Segregated South, published in 2011 by Northwestern University Press. Stephanie graduated from Brown University and has a master's degree in Soviet Union area studies from Harvard. Since 1975, she's lived on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. She's published articles and book reviews in the New York Times, the Washington Times, the Weekly Standard, Philanthropy Magazine, and the Millions blog. In addition to writing, she serves as chairman of the Grants Committee of the Capitol Hills Community Foundation, which gives away $250,000 a year in small grants. Dr. Daniel L Hallman is chief of the Organization History Division at the Air Force Historical Research Agency and the co-author of The Tuskegee Airmen, An Illustrated History, 1939 to 1949. He earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Southwestern Louisiana, his master's degree from the University of New Orleans, and his PhD in history from Auburn University. Before pursuing his PhD, Dr. Haulman taught high school social studies in Louisiana for 5 years. He's authored 5 books about aviation history, written 3 Air Force pamphlets, as well as several book chapters, studies, and 16 published articles. He's taught at Huntington College, Auburn University at Montgomery, and Faulkner University. So without further ado, I'll give you the authors, and we'll begin in chronological order by subject matter, which gives us Stephanie first. Thank you.
I'm particularly happy to have an opportunity to consider the subject of my book in the light of the civil rights movement, bringing it more into the present, because Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald, who were both extraordinarily well-known during their lifetimes, have been somewhat eclipsed in recent years. And Washington, in particular, has seen his reputation slide. He's been charged with being an accommodationist, being unwilling to place higher aspirations for African Americans, placing constrictions on what they could accomplish. And what I found in my study was quite the opposite, that he and Rosenwald together made a rather significant contribution to the period that led the way to the civil rights movement. Booker T. Washington, many of you probably remember, was born not too far from here in near Roanoke on a small family farm, was a slave as a child, and then was educated at Hampton University, Hampton Institute as it was then. In 1881, he traveled down to Alabama, where he was invited to be the founding principal of Tuskegee Institute, as it was then. Tuskegee was created on the model of Hampton as a school to educate teachers. At the end of slavery, of course, education was very much needed by the freedmen and very much wanted. And to have education, you have to have teachers. So Hampton had been created to educate teachers, and Tuskegee was created on the same model. By 1900, Tuskegee was a very successful school. Washington had several attributes that contributed to this. He was a good teacher and he was a very hard worker. He was also a brilliant fundraiser, and he spent a lot of his time traveling up north, making speeches and soliciting donations. And Tuskegee was a thriving institution. In 1895, he had an opportunity that thrust him into national limelight when he was invited to be a speaker at the Atlanta Cotton States exhibition. It was a kind of World's Fair, and he was the only African-American speaker there. He spoke for 5 minutes, giving a speech that was very positive and upbeat, talked about African-Americans and white people working together to strengthen the South, for mutual progress, for economic viability for all of them. And then in a passage that later became quite controversial, he said, in all things that are purely social, we blacks and whites can remain as separate as the fingers of our hand, but we will be as one as a fist in things that have to do with mutual benefit. In the wake of the speech, he became tremendously, tremendously famous. Harvard University gave him an honorary degree the next year. He and his wife took a trip to Europe, and they were invited to tea with Queen Victoria. He had dinner at the White House with Theodore Roosevelt. So he was increasingly famous and well-known. At the same time, despite all his optimism, this was a very difficult period, in fact, for African Americans. Plessy versus Ferguson in 1894 had mandated separate but equal, which was always separate but very rarely equal. So increasingly, jurisdictions were passing laws separating schools, hotels, playgrounds, parks. Not only that, the scourge of the states were passing legislation restricting voting, and African Americans who had been voting since freedom had come were being restricted from the ballot box and not able to vote. And lynching was, in my ignorance when I started my research, I thought of it as a very random, sometime thing, and I was shocked to discover how pervasive it was and what a source of fear it was in the African-American community. So in 1911, when Washington met Rosenwald, he had reason to be optimistic, but he also had a heavy load of responsibility about Tuskegee and anxiety about what was happening. Rosenwald was at that time the newly rich president of Sears Roebuck. His parents were Jewish immigrants from Germany. He had been born in Springfield, Illinois, where his father ran a small clothing store. He grew up there, learned the clothing trade from his uncles in New York, and then returned to Chicago to start his own business. In 1895, same year as Booker T. Washington had his opportunity with the speech, Rosenwald was invited to buy into a small unknown mail order company called Sears Roebuck, and that proved to be a very sound investment. Sears was just booming at the time, and as you all probably know, sold everything from your wedding ring to your tombstone. You could buy a house from Sears. So Rosenwald was very wealthy and bought himself a big house, took a trip to Europe, but then started looking around for philanthropic uses for his money. He always said that his money had come to him as much through good luck as through his own merit, and that he felt a certain responsibility to be a steward of it and to use it to benefit others. So he started with Jewish philanthropy in the Chicago community, and when he met Booker T. Washington, he was ready to look a little further. Two things had attracted his attention to African Americans. One was that one of the first race riots in America occurred in 1908 in Springfield, his hometown. And it was on the front page of the Chicago paper for 3 days. The black part of town was burned down. And it was a horrifying event, and particularly horrifying to Rosenwald, who had been giving money to the victims in Europe of the pogroms, which were the state-sponsored riots that were attacking Jewish communities at the time. About the same time, one of his friends gave him a copy of Up From Slavery, Washington's autobiography. And so in 1911, when they met at a luncheon in Chicago, these two men had quite good reasons to be anxious to meet each other.